black exterior of plastic molded to a rigid shell. I used to walk the busy avenue without a guard, exposing all my fragile timber to the concrete yard. The crowded street would bump my shoulders and scratch the wood, a constant friction breaking down exactly where I stood. My mind was just a hollow chamber prone to easy cracks, but you opened up the heavy lid and showed the deep maroon, a sanctuary hiding in the noisy afternoon. The crushed velvet padding traces every single curve, a dedicated harbor that my weary days observe. You laid me in the center of the soft and plush design and closed the heavy latches, making your protection mine. The outside world is throwing stones against the plastic lid, but I am resting safe inside the shelter we have hid. The velvet hold cushioning the fragile wooden spine, you do not let the rough and dirty concrete leave a mark. You wrap my tired body in the safety of the dark. I don't have to brace myself for every single hit. You give me a foundation where my broken pieces sit. The velvet hold cushioning the fragile wooden spine, you do not let the rough and dirty concrete leave a mark. You wrap my tired body in the safety of the dark. I don't have to brace myself for every single hit. You give me a foundation where my broken pieces sit. People try to face the weather, walking bare and brave, a stubborn sort of journey leading to an early grave, but dedicated boundary where the frantic from my weight, a tactile little diary of a very quiet fate. I trust the thick material to navigate the flight, a passenger asleep inside the middle of the night. Close the metal latch, keep the winter out, rest the weary wood, silence all the doubt. The padding is a barrier the sorrow cannot cross, a quiet preservation shielding me from any loss. I realize that loving is an insulated case, a willingness to map the borders of a fragile space. You didn't ask to change my tune or make my timber strong. You offered up a velvet bed where tired souls belong. I lay inside the darkness while you carry me around, the most reliable devotion I have ever found. The bumps along the sidewalk fade into a gentle hum, a lullaby preparing me for everything to come. I rest my tired strings upon the padding in the bass and find my true identity inside this quiet place. The velvet hold cushioning the fragile wooden spine, on the ground let the rough and dirty concrete leave a mark. You wrap my tired body in the safety of the dark. The outer shell takes all the damage from the freezing wind. I sleep inside your velvet and I know where I begin. The case is closed, the wood is safe, I am home. My days were full of sudden shocks and unforgiving noise, a frantic navigation, losing all my quiet poise. Every small mistake became an agonizing crash, turning good intentions into solitary ash. But you peeled back the paper on a tiny clear dot and pressed a little silicone into the troubled spot. You placed it on the corner where the timber meets the pine, a subtle vention drawing invisible line. The door swings fast but hits a designated quiet space, softening the close, taking out the anger and the sting. You don't just let the argument collide against the wood. You cushion the reality of where we always stood. I do not have to flinch when the momentum pushes through. You absorb the heavy damage and you make the silence true, softening the close, taking out the anger and the sting. You don't just let the argument collide against the wood. You cushion the reality of where we always stood. I do not have to flinch when the momentum pushes through. You absorb the heavy damage and you make the silence true. People try to take the doors right off the heavy hinge, a cowardly avoidance of the conversation fringe. But leaving things wide open is a terrifying chill, a lack of true protection for a tired, weary will. You keep the boundary standing, but you take away the bite, a masterclass in navigating through a messy fight. The little plastic bubble is invisible to see, but it provides the safest sort of remedy for me. Push the heavy wood, feel the quiet stop, lose the angry noise, let the tension drop. The timber finds the frame without a devastating hit. I trust the quiet boundary and rest inside of it. I realize that loving is a microscopic pad, a willingness to intercept the habits that I had. You didn't ask to tear the kitchen down and start anew. You placed a tiny buffer, making the connection true. I close the cabinet door and hear the satisfying thud, a mellow resignation calming down the rushing blood. The house is full of quiet where the arguments would ring, a testament to noticing the very smallest thing. I lean against the counter and I let my shoulders fall, grateful for the buffer that protects me from it all. Softening the clothes, safe inside anger and the sting. You don't just let the argument collide against the wood. You cushion the reality of where we always stood. The slamming is a memory, the evening air is calm. I trust your quiet patience like a necessary balm. The door shuts, the noise is gone, I am home.
A wooden stick of Pernambuco holding white horsehair, but wanting louder music means you press a little hard. A heavy kind of friction on a solitary yard. I drag the wooden bow across the strings to force a cry. a desperate endeavor underneath the fading sky. The hair began to separate and snap along the line. The broken fibers dangled from the center of the wood, erasing the integrity of where we always stood. The friction kills the ribbon and the instrument is dead. I cannot play the harmony that lived inside my head. Fraying the bow, breaking off the fibers in the dark, a devastating execution of a quiet spark. I try to drag the timber, but the melody is gone. You cannot force a symphony by tearing up the thread. I stare at the destruction of the bitter words we said. Fraying the bow, breaking off the fibers in the dark, a devastating execution of a quiet spark. I try to drag the timber, but the melody is gone. You cannot force a symphony by tearing up the thread. I stare at the destruction of the bitter words we said. I tried to clip the broken hair, to clean the messy view, to manufacture order in the fading me and you. But cutting loose the damage leaves the weapon far too thin. The compromised foundation where the tragedies begin. We pushed the conversation till the empathy was lost, ignoring the reality of such an awful cost. The bow is just a ragged and an uncooperative ghost, a cruel and heavy mockery of what I needed most. Pull the heavy wood, hear the awful scrape, fail to find the tune with no clear escape. The instrument is paralyzed, the music is a lie. I leave the broken ribbon and I whisper my goodbye. I realize that forcing an affection into song is guaranteeing failure if you drag the bow too long. Love requires a gentle and a calibrated sweep, not an overwhelming pressure making tired fibers weak. We broke the vital medium by asking for too much and ruined the capacity of any gentle touch. I placed the ruined timber in the velvet of the case, accepting the finale of this unrewarding place. The violin is silent and my hands are tired bare. I walk into the avenue and breathe the winter air. Fraying the bow, breaking off the fibers in the dark, a devastating execution of a quiet spark. I try to drag the timber, but the melody was dead. I surrender the illusion and I clear my tired head. You cannot force a symphony by tearing up the thread. I walk away from playing and I face the road ahead. The hair is snapped, the song is dead, I am done. A pool of hardened crimson sitting on the writing desk. We lit the tall pillar in the middle of the night to fill the empty shadows with a warm and blurry light. But staring at the fire means you miss the melting edge, the liquid wax cascading off the solitary ledge. It dripped upon the timber and it sank into the grain, a slow and creeping hazard mimicking the autumn rain. By morning light the fire died, the paraffin was cold, a rigid sort of ending to the story we were told. The red material bonded with the varnish of the pine, a devastating blemish on your history and mine. The wax is petrified into solid, the ruined pine stained by the careless tired will. The ruined pine stained crimson, but it takes the wood away. A miserable consequence of a forgotten day. You cannot burn a passion without watching for the spill. I stare at the destruction of a careless, tired will. The ruined pine stained by the careless dripping heat. I try to scrape the crimson, but it takes the wood away. A miserable consequence of a forgotten day. You cannot burn a passion without watching for the spill. I stare at the destruction of a careless, tired will. I took a plastic scraper just to pry the border loose, to try to manufacture an acceptable excuse. But forcing off the paraffin destroys the wooden seal. It rips the tender fibers that I desperately feel. We let our raw affection run without a designated plate. A foolish expectation of an understanding fate. The desk is marked forever by the choices that we made. A stark and ugly shadow in the solitary shade. Scrape the hardened red, watch the timber tear. Fail to clean the dust in the morning air. The residue is stubborn and the surface is destroyed. I walk away from fighting in an isolated void. I realize that forcing an extraction of the past is tearing up the boundary that was engineered to last. Love requires a saucer to contain the melting core, not a reckless pouring on a vulnerable floor. We ruin the foundation by ignoring the debris, entrapped a heavy silence sitting right in front of me. I dropped the plastic scraper in the garbage by the door, accepting I won't clean the heavy timber anymore. The desk will hold the crimson as a memory of the burn. I walk into the avenue with lessons I must learn. The ruined pine stained by the careless dripping heat, let it dry. I tried to scrape the crimson, but the varnish had to break. I surrender the illusion for my own exhausted sake. You cannot burn a passion without watching for the spill. I leave the broken timber and accept the fading chill. The wax is hard, the wood is scarred. I am done. A tall glass of ice water sitting in the summer heat. A frozen little island in the middle of a sad defeat. The humidity is rising in the air, the groaning curse. I used to let the water hit the surface of the pine, ruining the varnish in an ugly crooked line. The moisture left a ring that I could never wash away, a ghost of my anxiety upon a fading day. But you brought a circle cut from natural rugged bark and placed it on the table in the middle of the dark. You set the weeping glass upon the center of the brown, a gentle sort of anchor that refused to let me drown. The wood absorbs the sweat and keeps the timber safe and dry. You offer me a landing strip beneath an open sky. The Cork Foundation, catching every falling tear, a porous little remedy to wash away the fear. You don't demand the glass to stop sweating in the sun. You take the messy moisture till the afternoon is done. I don't have to ruin all the tables in the room. You give my heavy sorrow a specific place to bloom. The Cork Foundation, catching every falling tear, a porous little remedy to wash away the fear. You don't demand the glass to stop sweating in the sun. You take the messy moisture till the afternoon is done. I don't have to ruin all the tables in the room. You give my heavy sorrow
a specific place to bloom. People try to use a paper napkin for the spill, a flimsy sort of bandage with a very fragile will. The paper turns to mush and makes the situation worse, a temporary comfort masking an ongoing curse. But cork is born from trees that know the weather and the rain, a durable defender for an ordinary pain. This also holds the liquid and it dries into the air, a subtle intervention working quietly right there. Lift the freezing glass, wipe the water down. Trust the rugged wood in this noisy town. The table is unblemished and the surface is secure. I trust the simple nature of a remedy so pure. I realize that loving is an isolating pad, a willingness to cast the worst habits that I had. You didn't ask to empty out the water in the sink. You offered a perimeter for every thought I think. The ice is melting slow and the humidity is high. I stare at the reflection of the orange setting sky. The ring of condensation doesn't damage what we built. You took the overflowing and erased the heavy guilt. I slide the empty glass across the center of the wood and rest inside the safety of a love I understood. The Cork Foundation, catching every falling tear, a porous little remedy to wash away the fear. You don't demand the glass stop sweating in the sun. You offer up a buffer till the messy phase is done. The table stays unblemished and the shadow fades away. I trust your quiet anger as I wait to face the day. The glass is dry, the wood is safe. I am home. A pile of jagged iron loose inside a metal chest, a dangerous collection lacking any sort of rest. I kept my sharpest chisels and my wrenches in a pile. You reached inside the box and took a warning on your skin, a painful little hazard where the darker days begin. I used to carry weapons just to keep the world at bay, a hostile kind of armor I was wearing every day. The friction in the metal dulled the edges of the steel, a casualty of hiding every single thing I feel. But you brought out a sheet of heavy cotton woven tight, with pockets measured custom for the middle of the night. You slid the iron handles in the designated space and rolled the canvas up to tame the anger of the place. The fabric wraps the metal and it covers every blade, a tactical surrender of the promises I made. Woven slots, wrapping up the sharp and bitter steel, a quiet destination for the heavy things I feel. You don't just throw the weapons in the bottom of the lake, you organize the danger for my own exhausted sake. I don't have to cut my fingers reaching in the dark. You wrap my tired armor and protect the vital spark. Woven slots, wrapping up the sharp and bitter steel, a quiet destination for the heavy things I feel. You don't just throw the weapons in the bottom of the lake, you organize the danger for my own exhausted sake. I don't have to cut my fingers reaching in the dark. You wrap my tired armor and protect the vital spark. People try to force a change by melting down the knife, ignoring the reality and navigating life. But tools are only dangerous when handled in a rush, a chaotic sort of panic in the early morning hush. You roll the heavy canvas and you tie the leather cord, securing all the baggage I had previously ignored. The parcel sits in silence on the corner of the bench, a peaceful resolution for the chisel and the wrench. Roll the fabric tight, hide the silver edge, keep the fingers safe, step back from the ledge. The cotton is a guardian against the metal bite. I trust a simple boundary to get me through the night. I realize that loving is a catalog of grace, a willingness to map out a forbidding angry place. You didn't ask to strip away the edges of my soul, you built a safe perimeter and made the pieces whole. I untied the leather string and laid the canvas flat. I find the exact instrument and leave the world at that. The chisels do the work without inflicting any pain, a masterpiece of managing the sorrow in the rain. I wrap the heavy bundle and I offer up a smile.
I know this quiet safety is gonna last a while. Woven slots, wrapping up the sharp and bitter steel, safe inside a quiet destination for the heavy things I feel. You don't store the weapons in the bottom of the sea. You organize the danger and you hand it back to me. The iron rests in cotton and the panic fades away. I trust your quiet canvas as I wake to face the day. The roll is tight, the edge is safe, I am home. Yeah. A length of crimson wool wrapping tight around my neck, a barrier defending from a sudden winter wreck. We knitted all the fibers in the dents and promised to endure the bitter freezing in the snow. But walking through the doorway, I brushed the wooden hinge. Your careless sort of movement on a microscopic fringe. A tiny loop of cotton caught a splinter in the pine. A sudden hesitation on the boundary of the line. I didn't stop to untangle the mistake upon the door. I kept my pace and dragged the heavy fiber to the floor. The yarn began to pull and pull the pattern all apart. A devastating error in the center of the heart. The thread escapes the structure and the fabric starts to run. A tragic illustration of the damage I have done. The snagged thread, ruining the shelter of the cold. A miserable bend into a story getting old. I try to stop the pulling, but the damage is too deep. A casualty of secrets that a tired toe can't keep. You cannot wear a garment when the fiber is destroyed. Oh, I stand beside the doorway in an isolated void. Yeah. The snagged thread, ruining the shelter of the cold. A miserable ending to a story getting old. I try to stop the pulling, but the damage is too deep. A casualty of secrets that a tired soul can't keep. You cannot wear a garment when the fiber is destroyed. Oh, I stand beside the doorway in an isolated void. I tried to tie a knot to halt the rapid running line, to orchestrate a rescue of your history in mind. But knot and broken cotton only leaves a gaping hole, a chilling draft attacking the perimeter of the soul. We let a tiny argument snag on a bitter word and drag it out until the original meaning blurred. The scarf is just a pile of an uncoordinated string, a terrifying echo of the song we used to sing. Pull the crimson yarn, watch the pattern fade. Fail to stop the run in the choices made. The winter air is rushing through the opening I tore. I cannot wrap the fabric round my shoulders anymore. I realize that forcing an unraveling design is volunteering to delete the boundary of the line. Love requires attention to the splinters in the wood, a willingness to pause and fix the places where we stood. We ruined the foundation by ignoring the delay and watch the vital armor slowly disappear away. I take the pile of red and toss it in the waiting bin, accepting the finale of the era we were in. I leave the doorway standing and I walk into the street. Oh, accepting the reality of this profound defeat. The snagged thread, going in the shelter of the cold. Let it drop at the miserable end into a story getting old. Time to stop, time to stop. Oh, I tried to stop the pulling, but the pattern had to break. I surrendered the illusion for my own exhausted sake. You cannot wear a garment when the fiber is destroyed. I leave the ruined fabric and I step into the void. The thread runs, the scarf is gone, I am walking. Yellow plastic casing holding a ribbon of bright steel. We pull the yellow metal just to measure up the hole, to verify the borders of the rising plaster wall. The numbers were a comfort printed neat along the edge. I wanted to record the longest distance in the room, to push the tape across the shadows hiding in the gloom. I pulled the silver tab past the warning painted red, ignoring the reality of all the things you said. A tiny little breaking of a complicated spell. The inner coil shattered and the tension disappeared, validating every single tragedy I feared. The ribbon lies exhausted on the dusty wooden pine. I cannot pull the metal back across the broken line. Jammed in the steel, stuck on a rigid open track. I push the plastic button but the metal doesn't slide. A miserable ending to a solitary pride. You cannot reel the future when the inner spring is gone. I stare at the destruction and I cannot carry on. Jammed in the steel, stuck on a rigid open track. I push the plastic button but the metal doesn't slide. A miserable ending to a solitary pride. You cannot reel the future when the inner spring is gone. I stare at the destruction and I cannot carry on. I tried to push the ribbon back inside the plastic case, to forcibly restore the order in a messy space. But pushing yellow steel crease stretched our expectations past the limit of the band, demanding more devotion than the tired heart could stand. The tape is lying crooked, a pathetic sort of snake, a visual reminder of a devastating ache. Push the yellow tape, feel the metal bend, fail to reach the base where the numbers end. The distance is a permanent and unretracting space. I'm standing in the failure of a complicated place. I realize that forcing a connection past the red is guaranteeing tragedy is waiting just ahead. Love requires a boundary and a limit to the pull. You cannot stretch a fraction and expect to keep it full. We ruined the foundation by demanding it to prove, and broke the very mechanism allowing it to move. I pick the tangled metal up and drop it in the trash, accepting that the history is turned to silent ash. I do not need a tape to measure how far we have grown. I walk into the avenue and navigate alone. Jammed in the steel, stuck on a rigid, let it drop, let it drop. Jammed in the steel, I'm stuck on a rigid, let it drop. I try to push the metal but the ribbon had the kink. I surrender the illusion and I empty out the sink. You cannot reel a future when the inner spring is gone. I leave the broken instrument and quietly move on. I used to load it up and watch the metal start to walk. A terrifying rattle overriding all the talk. The balance was a fraction of an inch from being true. The chaotic navigation create a muddy view. I lean my heavy shoulders on the surface of the top, trying to demand the terrifying tremor to stop. But muscle cannot argue with an engine out of line. It leaves a heavy bruising on this tired heart of mine. But you got down and reached beneath the corner of the base, finding the specific error in a hidden place. You turn the threaded metal pad a millimeter down, silencing the loudest panic in the sleeping town. The heavy machine settles on the solid tile. The first time I have taken a relaxing breath. Still in the spin, balancing the heavy, frantic. You don't just push against the side and hope the tremor ends. You calibrate the level like the truest of my friends. I do not have the battle with the shaking in the dark. You twist a little metal and preserve the steady spark. Still in the spin, balancing the head. Still in the spin, still in the spin. Still in the spin, balancing the heavy spin. You don't just push against the side and hope the tremor ends. You calibrate the level like the truest of my friends. I do not have the battle with with the shaking in the dark. You twist a little metal and preserve the steady spark. People at a heavy rock to try and pin it down. A temporary bandage that will never save the crown. But true stability requires an adjustment on the root. A willingness to navigate a highly dirty route. You didn't mind the dust beneath the heavy metal frame. You entered in the shadow and you dignified my name. The spinning cycle hits the max, but everything is still a masterpiece of navigating an erratic will. Turn the silver thread, find the perfect height. Stop the sudden walk in the fading light. The rhythm is a comfort and the panic fades away. I trust the quiet anchor as I navigate the day. I realize that loving is a tiny hidden gear, a willingness to rectify the source of every fear. You didn't ask to change the drum or buy a different load. You found the imperfection on an ordinary road. I lay my hand upon the lid and feel the quiet hum, a reassuring signal of the better days to come. The floorboards are untroubled and the laundry is secure. I trust the simple mechanism that is steady, pure. I walk into the hallway and I let my shoulders drop, grateful for the anchor where my frantic habits stop. Standing the stairs in my head. You do not push against the side. Hope the tremor ends. You calibrate the foundation like the truest of my friends. The washing cycle finishes without an ugly fight. I trust your quiet logic in the middle of the night. The shake is gone. The balance holds, I am home. The shake is gone. Stiff and heavy jacket resting on the cedar chair, a victim of the freezing in the unforgiving air. I wore it through the tempest and I let it dry in dust, ignoring the perimeter of necessary trust. The sleeves became inflexible, resisting every bend, the paralyzing armor at the journey's sudden end. My heart was just a rigid shell refusing to align, a petrified topography I claimed as strictly mine. I tried to put the jacket on but couldn't move my arm, a consequence of carrying a solitary harm. But you brought out a little tin of heavy yellow balm and rubbed it in the fabric with the dedicated calm. You worked the heavy ointment in the center of the crease, providing the exhausted height and necessary peace. The moisture sinks into the grain and softens up the wall. Storing the high, taking out the rigid bitter cold. A story of recovery that never gets too old. You do not let the armor crack and shatter in the night. You feed the thirsty leather and restore the fading light. I do not have to walk around inside a petrified shell. You soften up the edges of a solitary hell. Swimming the high, taking out the rigid bitter cold. Safe inside, story of recovery that never gets too old. Nowhere to hide. Do not let the armor crack and shatter in the night. You feed the thirsty leather and restore the fading light. I do not have to walk around inside a petrified shell. You soften up the edges of a solitary hell. People throw the jacket in the corner of the room, accepting the arrival of an unrewarding doom. But you respect the history the heavy fabric took. You give it a dedicated and an understanding look. The surface takes a deeper brown and loses all the gray, a visual recovery from a devastating day. I slip my tired shoulders in the comfortable sleeve and feel the quiet freedom that my weary lungs believe. Whoa. Work the heavy oil, watch the colors turn, heal the broken grain, soothe the quiet burn. The stiffness is a memory that washes down the drain. I am walking with the flexibility again. I realize realize that loving is a very tactile cure, a willingness to make an empty boundary secure. You didn't ask to trade me for a softer, newer coat. You nourished the perimeter of my sinking heavy boat. The jacket used to every single motion that I make, a beautiful phenomenon for my exhausted sake. I zip the heavy metal and I step into the breeze, protected from the biting of the unexpected freeze. I touch the supple collar and I look into your eyes, a masterpiece of comfort underneath the open skies. Warming the high, taking out the rigid bit inside, safe inside. Story of recovery that never gets too old. Nowhere to hide, not let the armor crack and shatter in the night. Ooh. You feed the thirsty leather and prepare me for the fight. The jacket is a second skin, a refuge from the grave. I trust your quiet remedy as I walk into the day. The leather bends, the chill is gone, I am warm. A tiny silver cylinder projecting on the days. We dropped the vinyl record on the center of the pin to navigate the rhythm of the era we were in. But we stacked a heavy weight upon the center of the deck, a reckless expectation on a solitary track. I pushed the stubborn record down without a proper care, a sudden execution in the solitary air. The silver pole submitted to the unforgiving force and snapped directly off its necessary central course. The vinyl slid across the mat and hit the plastic lid, a devastating rendering the damage we just did. The rotation is impossible without a guiding pin, the tragic little ending to the world we started in. Snapping the cord, losing all the center of the spin, a devastating silence where the music had been. I try to place the vinyl, but it slides across the board, a visual reminder of the damage I ignored. You cannot play a future when the central axis dies. I stare at the destruction underneath the empty sky. Lord, snapping the cord, losing all the center of the spin, the devastating silence, oh, where the music had been. I try to place the vinyl, but it slides across the board, a visual reminder of the damage I ignored. You cannot play a future when the central axis dies. I stare at the destruction underneath the empty skies. Hey. I tried to glue the cylinder to resurrect the track, to artificially construct a way to wander back. But spinning heavy plastic needs an undisputed core, a microscopic weakness throws a vinyl on the floor. We ruined the foundation by demanding it to bend, and executed every single promise of a friend. The needle drops on rubber and produces awful noise, a miserable casualty of our erratic choice. Drop the heavy disc, watch the vinyl slide, fail to find the groove, nowhere left to hide. The center is demolished and the gravity is gone. I do not have the anchor to continue holding on. I realize that forcing a connection past the root is guaranteeing failure on a solitary route. Love requires an axis that is treated with respect, not a brutal hammering of arrogant neglect. We broke the vital instrument by rushing up the pace and locked ourselves entirely out of the sacred space. I sweep the broken silver from the center of the mat, accepting the reality and leaving it at that. I put the silent record in the cardboard of the sleeve and walk into the avenue preparing just to leave. Snapping the cord, losing all the center of the spin, let it drop, a devastating silence. Time to stop, time to stop. I tried to place the vinyl, but the gravity was dead. I surrendered the illusion and I clear my tired head. You cannot play a future when the central axis dies. I leave the broken instrument and whisper my goodbye. The pen is broke, the deck is still, I'm done. silver cylinders connected to the front wheel. A pneumatic defender for the damage I could feel. We pumped the air pressure to a solitary high to conquer all the gravel underneath the autumn sky. The suspension absorbed every jagged, sudden dip. A quiet navigator on a complicated trip. But rubber seals decay inside the friction of the dust. A silent execution of an undeniable trust. I rode into a pothole expecting a gentle glide, but the air escaped the chamber in a sudden quiet hiss, erasing every fraction of the customary bliss. The metal bottomed out with the horrifying clank, a physical translation of an empty, broken bank. The impact travels upward to the center of my bone, a jarring realization I am riding all alone. Deflating the fall, crashing on the rigid, heavy steel. I try to ride the gravel, but the boundary is dead, leaving me the echo of the bitter words we said. You cannot smooth the journey when the oxygen is gone. I stare at the destruction and I cannot carry on. Deflating the fall, crashing on the rigid, heavy steel. I try to ride the gravel, but the boundary is dead, leaving me the echo of the bitter words we said. You cannot smooth the journey when the oxygen is gone. I stare at the destruction and I cannot carry on. I try to push the valve, to force a little pressure and to orchestrate a rescue where the tragedies begin. But pumping and exhausted, and the compromise seal is dodging the reality of everything I feel. We lost the buffer zone by ignoring all the wear and sacrificed the journey to a suffocating air. The ride is agonizing, transferring every hit, a terrifying ending I am ready to admit. Hit the heavy rock, feel the silver crash. Lose the quiet ride, turn the dream to ash. The shock is unabsorbed and the consequence is clear. I am standing in the wreckage of a solitary fear. I realize that forcing an unprotected ride is choosing to dismantle every place we used to hide. Love requires a boundary to mitigate the stress, not a rigid metal clashing in an isolated mess. We broke the vital instrument by asking for too much and ruin the capacity of any gentle touch. I step off of the pedals and I drop the heavy frame, accepting the finale of this terrifying game. I leave the broken bicycle resting in the dirt and walk away from managing the unavoidable hurt. Deflating the fall, crashing on the rigid, let it drop, let it drop, let it drop. I try to ride the gravel, but the mechanism died. I surrender the illusion to the weary rising tide. You cannot smooth the journey when the oxygen is gone. I leave the broken instrument and quietly move on. Out, the shock is hard, I am walking. I used to try to play the cello leaning on the wood, an S-straight maneuver just to stay right where I stood. The metal spike would slip across the polish of the floor, a frustrating distraction I could not pretend to ignore. My posture was corrupted by the sliding of the bass, a miserable struggle in a solitary place. I couldn't draw the bow without the instrument sliding away. But you walked in and handed me a strip of solid oak, a quieted intervention just before the rhythm broke. You hooked the nylon tether to the bottom of the chair and dropped the wooden anchor in the solitary air. The metal finds the diver in the center of the wood. The instrument is standing right exactly where it should. The wooden rest catching all the slipping in the dark, a steady sort of harbor for a complicated spark. You do not play the strings or try to dominate the song. You build a quiet structure where the melodies belong. I do not have to wrestle with the gravity no more. You give my heavy spirit a foundation on the floor. The wooden rest catching all the slipping in the dark. Oh, steady sort of harbor for a complicated spark. You do not play the strings or try to dominate the song. You build a quiet structure where the melodies belong. I do not have to wrestle with the gravity no more. You give my heavy spirit a foundation on the floor. People try to force the floor to tolerate the scratch, ignoring all the damage of a solitary match. But you respect the timber and you mitigate the pain. A master class in navigating through the freezing rain. The anchor has a dozen little holes to find a fit, a customized allowance for the places I commit. I lean the heavy instrument against my tired chest, protected by the certainty of an undeniable rest. Drop the silver spike, feel the timber hold, draw the heavy bow, brave and very bold. The slipping is defeated and the music is secure. I trust the quiet safety that is absolute and pure. I realize that loving is foundational. You didn't ask to change the tune or edit out the flat. You gave me a foundation and you left the world at that. I play a deep adagio that echoes in the hall, a testament to standing up and conquering the fall. The tether holds the tension and the anchor doesn't slide. A very private universe where weary spirits hide. I play the final measure and I look into your eyes, protected from the panic of the unexpected skies. The wooden rest, catching all the slipping in the dark. Safe and steady sort of harbor for a complicated spark. You do not play the strings or try to dominate the song. You give a solid landing where the melodies belong. I trust your quiet haven as I wake to face the day. The spike is set, the cello sings, I am home.
The cylinder of glass pointed out across the bay, trying to record the final moments of the day. The sunset was a brilliant and an overwhelming red, but light has a chaotic and unpredictable reach. The stray reflections bounced across the M inside, leaving absolutely nowhere for the focus just to hide. The image was washed out in a hazy, muddy white, but you handed me a petal-shaped and sturdy plastic ring. A simple intervention altering the entire thing. I twisted it upon the thread and locked it into place. A sudden kind of clarity inside a complicated space. The plastic blocks the ambient and parasitic ray, restoring the horizon at the closing of the day. Catching the glare, filtering overwhelming light. You do not let my vision get corrupted by the noise. You block the interference and restore my quiet poise. I do not have to guess about the colors in the frame. You give my eyes a window to eradicate the blame. Catching the glare, filtering overwhelming light. You do not let my vision get corrupted by the noise. You block the interference and restore my quiet poise. I do not have to guess about the colors in the frame. You give my eyes a window to eradicate the blame. flows across the mind, leaving all the guesswork and the heavy doubt behind. The hood is unassuming, painted in a matte and dusty black. A loyal little soldier keeping all the shadows back. I look into the viewfinder and see the ocean clear, a visual awakening I attribute back to here. Turn the plastic ring, watch the haze depart, see the honest truth in the weary heart. The stray reflections vanish and the image is secure. I trust the quiet boundary that makes the vision pure. I realize that loving is a very clarifying sweep, a willingness to wake a tired spirit from a sleep. You don't just ask me blindly to pretend the view is fine. You take the proper instrument and clear the dividing line. I press the silver shutter and I capture every hue, a masterpiece of seeing through the world to get to you. The sun is dropping lower, but the picture is a prize, protected from the panic of the unexpected skies. I pack the heavy camera and I leave it in the case, grateful for the clarity you brought into the space. Catching the glare, I am here, overwhelming light. Doesn't fear, let my vision get corrupted by the noise. You wipe away the panic and restore my quiet poise. The picture is a portal to an undiscovered grace. I stand beside your clarity and find my proper place. The lens is clear, the picture holds I am seeing.
A red and white sphere floating on the surface of the pond, a tiny plastic anchor holding on to the beyond. We cast the nylon line into the middle of the deep. The bobber rolled the ripples with an undeniable fact, but we neglected all the tension on the solitary track. But underwater currents pull with unexpected force, a silent deviation from the solitary course. A heavy branch, the limit, and the fiber snapped into a sudden execution of the link to me and you. The plastic sphere is liberated from the guiding hand, drifting aimless far away from any solid land, sinking lit, drifting in the middle of the way. A tragic illustration of a love we couldn't save. I try to watch the plastic, but it vanishes from sight. A silent execution in the middle of the night. You cannot reel a future when the connection is destroyed. I stare at the destruction in an isolated void, sinking lit, drifting in the middle of the wave. A tragic illustration of a love we couldn't save. I try to watch the plastic, but it vanishes from sight. A silent execution in the middle of the night. You cannot reel a future when the connection is destroyed. I stare at the destruction in an isolated void. I tried to find a branch to drag the plastic to the shore, to artificially construct the way it was before. But reaching out for flotsam is an agonizing game, a miserable tactic with no solitary blame. We thought our steady promise was an undeniable fact, but we neglected all the tension on the solitary track. The bobber hits a rapid and is swallowed by the foam, a visual confession of a devastated home. Watch the plastic spin, lose the steady line, fail to reach the shore of your life and mine. The
proof is just an echo of a very distant past. We built a weak foundation that was never meant to last. I realized that clinging to a fabricated trace is volunteering for an empty and a hollow space. Love requires a presence, not a fading dial on the string. You cannot find a future in a disconnected thing. We stretched the good intentions till the fibers had to tear, and sacrificed the memory in solitary air. I reeled the empty line onto the cylinder of gold, accepting the reality of stories we were told. I do not need a barber to validate the pain. I turn my collar upward and I step into the race, sinking, drifting in the middle of the way. Let it tragic illustration of the love we couldn't say. Time to stop. I try to watch the plastic, but the river washed it down. I surrender the illusion and forget the empty tone. You cannot build a future when the connection is destroyed. I drop the broken tackle and I walk into the void. The line is cut, the water flows, I am leaving. Tiny steel fastener buried in the wooden frame. We try to pull the structure into an absolution line. I place the silver driver into the center of the core, expecting the resistance that I felt day before. I twisted down the handle with an arrogant demand, ignoring the fragility I couldn't understand. The metal slipped and rounded off the corners of the cross, the physical translation of a suffocated loss. The tool just spins in circles without catching on a side, a quiet little trap where the weary shadows hide. The grip is gone entirely, the intersection dead, a visual reality of bitter things we said. The driver rotates freely inside the ruined face. I try to turn the lever, but the metal refuses to catch. We burned away the friction and eradicated the match. You cannot tighten up a bond when the corners turn to dust. I stare at the destruction of a solitary trust. I stare at the destruction of a solitary trust. I try to push a rubber band inside the empty gap to manufacture leverage on a solitary map, but adding superficial tricks to broken heavy steel is a cowardly avoidance of the panic that I feel. We force the conversation past the tolerance of a joint, demanding a perfection to an isolated point. The screw is resting permanently trapped inside the wood, a terrifying lesson that we never understood. Twist the silver arm, feel the hollow spin, accept the quiet end where the tears begin. The angle is corrupted and the symmetry is gone. I do holding on. I realize that forcing a connection past the line is volunteering to destroy the original design. Love requires a mutual and delicate dance. We ruin the foundation by demanding it to yield, and shattered the perimeter of a solitary field. I pull the metal tool away and drop it on the floor, accepting I will never turn the handle anymore. The shelf is hanging awkwardly, unfixable and sad. I walk away from fighting for the history we had. The straight thread spinning in an empty quiet. Let it go. I tried to turn the lever. Now I know. I tried to turn the lever, but the intersection failed. I surrender the illusion to the sorrow that prevailed. You cannot tighten up a bond when the corners turn to dust. I drop the broken instrument and leave the broken trust. The boat is round, the grip is lost. I am done.
A woven rug of ivory resting on the polished floor. I used to step upon it rushing in from out the rain. The fabric had no anchor on the slick and varnished wood. It slid across the room from right exactly where I stood. My feet went flying upward and my shoulders hit the ground. The jarring introduction to the silence all around. I live my life in motion with no friction on the base. A hazardous existence in a very open space. But you brought a grid of rubber cut to fit the woven size. A hidden intervention underneath my tired eyes. You laid it in the shadows right beneath the ivory thread, securing the foundation of the anxious words I said. The rubber bites the timber and it grips the fabric tight. You give my step attraction in the middle of the night. Gripping the weave, locking down the sliding cotton base. You do not change the pattern or demand a different room. You lay an unseen anchor and erase the rising doom. I walk across the timber and the fabric doesn't move. You give my tired footsteps a reliable, safe groove. Gripping the weave, locking down the sliding cotton base. You do not change the pattern or demand a different room. You lay an unseen anchor and erase the rising doom. I walk across the timber and the fabric doesn't move. You give my tired footsteps a reliable, safe groove. People try to tiptoe and avoid the center square. Walking on a tightrope takes a massive mental toll. It drains the honest energy from any human soul. You don't expect the cautious in an artificial stride. You formulate a haven where my honest habits hide. The rug is standing firm against the rushing of the day. I rest upon the cotton and I let the worries fray. Step on the ivory, trust the hidden grid. Drop the heavy guard over what we did. The floor is slick as ice, but the center holds so true. I walk into the parlor and I trace it back to you. I realize that loving is an underneath design. A willingness to stabilize the intersections fine. You didn't ask for credit when the living room was safe. You stayed beneath the surface to prevent the bitter chafe. I stand in the apartment and I drop my heavy bags. No longer falling victim to the random sudden snags. The foundation is a rock, the hesitation fades away. I trust the unseen rubber as I navigate the day. I lean against the sofa and I offer up a smile. I know this firm footing is going to last a while. Gripping the weave, locking down the sliding cotton base. You do not change the pattern or demand a different room. You lay an unseen anchor and eradicate the gloom. The fabric holds the friction, and the panic fades to white. I trust your hidden armor in the middle of the night. The rock holds, the step is firm. I am home.
A jar of salted water sitting on the pantry shelf. A slow impatient process hiding deep inside itself. I filled the glass container with the harvest of the year, expecting an extraction of the bitterness and fear. But things have a tendency to float up to the air, exposing all the edges to a toxic, dark despair. The air is a corruption to the changes in the deep. It ruins all the promises the water tries to keep. I watch the floating pieces turn to pale and awful gray, a failure of the process at the fading of the day. But you brought a disc of glass crafted heavy for the jar, a solid intervention for exactly who we are. You dropped it in the liquid and it pushed the harvest down, protecting all the efforts in the center of the town. The pressure keeps the fragile limbs beneath the tide, a safe and dark arena where the weary things can hide. Below the surface, holding back the ruin in the air, a heavy sort of anchor for a complicated care. You do not let my anxious habits float up to the sky. You push them in the water so the panic has to die. I do not have to spoil in an unprotected space. You give my evolution a reliable, dark base. Below the surface, holding back the ruin in the air, a heavy sort of anchor for complicated care. You do not let my anxious habits float up to the sky. You push them in the water so the panic has to die. I do not have to spoil in an unprotected space. You give my evolution a reliable, dark base. People try to rush the seasons, walking in the sun, expecting an arrival when the work is never done. But transformation happens in a pressurized domain, a slow immersion hiding from the sorrow in the rain. The glass is transparent but it carries massive weight, a perfect mechanism for a complicated fate. I watch the tiny bubbles rising up across the side, a living testament to dropping on my hollow pride. Sink into the deep, watch the water hold, trust the heavy glass, let the truth unfold. The atmosphere is blocked and the changing is secure. I trust the patient method that is absolute and pure. I realize that loving is a weighted patient hand, a willingness to sink into a very different land. You didn't leave my worries floating upward to decay. You pushed them in the brine to wash the bitterness away. The weeks turn into months and the flavor starts to turn, a rich and deep reward for the things I had to learn. I open up the jar and take the heavy crystal out, erasing every fraction of the suffocating doubt. The harvest is a masterpiece, preserved and standing strong. I lean into your gravity and know where I belong. Below the surface, holding back the ruin in the safe inside, a heavy sort of anchor for complicated care. Nowhere to hide, my anxious habits float up to the sky. You push them in the water, letting all the panic die. The transformation finishes, the flavor is profound. I trust your heavy anchor with my feet upon the ground. The weight is real, the change is done, I am safe.
A wooden handle holding rows of sharpened silver wire. We stared at the corrosion on the iron of the gate. I took the heavy brush to scrub the oxidation clean, to find the solid metal that my tired eyes had seen. I pressed the jagged fibers deep against the ruined steel, ignoring the exhaustion that my heavy hands would feel. The friction was aggressive, scraping back and forth in vain, a loud and awful scratching in the middle of the rain. But rust that settles deep ignores a superficial sweep. It hardens in the center where the bitter memories sleep. The wire bristles bent and flattened out against the wood, a tragic illustration of exactly where we stood. The metal hairs are crushed into a useless tangled mess, a physical translation. Bent bristles sliding on a stubborn coat of red. I try to scrub the surface, but the instrument's dead. You cannot clean a history when the damage goes too deep. I drop the broken handle and I walk away to weep. Then bristles sliding on a stubborn coat of red. then I walk away to weep. I tried to turn the angle to expose a sharper side, to manufacture leverage where the tire shadows hide. But bending broken wire doesn't make the metal bite, it only brings an injury to complicate the night. We forced the conversation, trying hard to clear the past, expecting the affection to miraculously last. The brush is missing pieces, leaving bare and empty wood, a monument to losing everything we understood. Scrub the heavy gate, hear the useless sound, watch the wire break, fall upon the ground. The rust remains untouched, and the tool is ruined bare. I stand in the defeat and breathe the freezing winter air. I realize the force and the extraction of the pain is guaranteeing failure in the middle of the rain. Love requires a surface that is willing to be cleared, not a hardened fortress validating all we fear. We wore away our empathy by asking for a scrub, and washed away the magic in a broken bitter tub. I tossed the Reuben brush into the garbage by the fence, accepting the reality of agonizing sense. The gate will stay corroded, locking out the passing day. I turn my collar upward and I turn to walk away. Then bristles sliding on a stubborn coat, let it drop, let time to stop. I try to scrub the surface, but the wire had to break. I surrendered the illusion for my own exhausted sake. You cannot clean a history when the instrument is dead. I leave the rusted iron and I clear my tired head. The brush is flat, the rust is deep, I am done. A green and yellow nozzle threaded on a rubber hose, a tool to feed the garden where the fragile blossom grows. The Dow had a dozen different settings on the face. We used to turn the collar to accommodate the seed, providing the exact precipitation it would need. But leaving it attached all through the heat of mid-July invited the hard water to accumulate and dry. The calcium cemented in the center of the ring, a paralyzing burden on a necessary thing. I grabbed the plastic candle just to water up the lawn, expecting the gentle misting as the afternoon dragged on. I squeezed the metal trigger and a violent jet shot out, a high-pressure disaster washing out the tiny sprout. I twist the yellow dial, but the calcium is stone. The water hits the garden like an angry, bitter tone. Locked on the spray, blasting all the petals in the dirt, harsh and sudden rendering an undeniable hurt. I try to find the gentle mold, but plastic doesn't turn, leaving just an arrogant and suffocating burn. You cannot feed the garden with the violent heavy jet. I stare at the destruction and a heavy sad regret. Locked on the spray, blasting all the petals in the dirt, a harsh and sudden rendering an undeniable hurt. I try to find the gentle mold, but plastic doesn't turn, leaving just an arrogant and suffocating burn. You cannot feed a garden with the violent heavy jet. I stare at the destruction and a heavy sad regret. I tried to use a wrench to force the dial past the white, to manufacture softness in the middle of the night. But calcified machinery resists an angry twist, it shatters in the fingers, leaving nothing but the mist. We locked our communication in the harshest bitter tone, refusing to accommodate the fragile breaking bone. The stream of heavy water tears a crater in the mud, a visual reflection of an angry rushing flood. Pull the silver grip, watch the water blast, fell to find the soft nothing built to last. The mechanism frozen in the most aggressive state. I walk away from fighting with the complicated fate. I realize that forcing an inflexible response is trapping all affection in an isolated trance. Love requires a dial that can moderate the pace, not a brutal pressure washing out a fragile place. We ruin the foundation by demanding it to strike, and ruin all the beauty on a solid
solitary hike. I drop the plastic nozzle in the center of the yard, accepting the reality is undeniably hard. The faucet gets shut off and all the water drains away. I leave the broken instrument and navigate the day locked on a spray, blasting all the pedals in the dirt. Let it fall, a harsh and sudden rendering, lose it all. I tried to turn the dial, but the calcium was dead. I abandoned the illusion and I clear